go to the theory segment, one that we were talking about this before the pod. I think this is our most recurring segment. It's the only one that I know I've done 3 years in a row. I usually try to come up with new segments every year. One, it could just be hard to do it for 17 weeks, 18 this year, but also this one is just really important. And one that people ask about all the time. And we actually got a question from a user in Discord, which we'll get to shortly. But the reason that I bring it, that I think it's worth revisiting every year, is because I think it really is the single biggest edge in DFS. Everybody has access to player projections. Most people have access to some kind of decent lineup optimizer. So even your worst DFS players, people understand fantasy football pretty well. Like even the worst player can put together, it's probably a really bad lineup in DFS theory terms, but like they're not picking egregious players and they're going to luck into some good scores. So I did a poll before we hopped on here. What's your approach to late swap on NFL DFS main slate? 21% said they use it almost every week. 24% said they rarely or never use it. 49% said they should use it more often, but they don't. 6% said they only use it for injuries. So 80% of this poll said they're not using late swap every week. And that is from my Twitter followers. So like that's people that are mostly fantasy football oriented. Who am I kidding? All fantasy football oriented. No one's following me for anything else. And a lot of them are DFS centric. So like if it's 20% in that poll, the reality is probably less than 5% of the field is using late swap every week or even thinking about using late swap. So I think it is just a crazy edge. So first I'll throw the question at you, let you like shortly answer the question, then we'll get into some of the specifics of late swap. So a couple weeks ago on our cash game review, you briefly mentioned like you wish you would have left yourself some outs. You wish you would have had some more late swap guys. This is a cash game question, so we'll talk about cash games and GPPs, but I think it's interesting that our Discord user framed it as a cash game question. So he asked, Matt, can you expand on the concept of optionality of late swap from the cash game review show? So basically he said, should we be building cash lineups in favor of late players for late swaps? And are you predetermining who your late swaps options are? So like, are you giving up expected value just to have late swap players?
The short answer is no.
Yeah.
How many times when you compare two players, does it get to be a true toss-up? First of all, ask yourself that question and be honest with yourself. Sometimes for me, that answer in a week is hardly ever yes, or it's very rare. Other weeks, it feels like the projection is the same, the matchup's about the same, the opportunity is about the same, and so there's no way to discern one player from the next. You're basically, dare I say it, guessing from that point forward. If that's the case, then I'm probably leaning towards the later player because it gives me more options as I get to the late games, when I have more information about what has occurred for my 1 p.m. games. Now, if I feel like I can discern a value difference, I'm not really leaving that on the table for the most part. But to answer your second part of that question, are you predetermining who your late swap options are? You bet I am. Yeah. Even if it's just a rankings list, just 10 players on a napkin is better than not having any idea. Because the truth is, we're all watching the games. We all have our setup. We're all seeing things happen. And we need to make our late swap options in the 3 p.m. Eastern hour where the players that we have in our lineups are currently scoring points. So we're working with incomplete information still. But the biggest thing we need to do is just have a predetermined process so that we can quickly move, so that we can get this done in a short amount of time, because we're often doing cash and GPP late swap at the same time.
Yeah, I think at the very bare minimum, that you should have an idea of, and I mean, there are times where you're just going to do some mass late swaps, and in that case, like pretty much the whole field in the late window is going to be available to you, just depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And we'll get into the specifics of that. But at the very least, I think most of the time when we're talking about like having options for late swaps, it's because you're going to have a player that is going to be very popular that you're going to probably swap off of because you're behind and trying to catch the field. So you should have an idea of who that player is, who the most popular player is, and sometimes just who the most expensive player is. And if it's going to be a straight 1-for-1 swap, or if you're going to be swapping out more than one player. So at the very minimum, figure out who that player is, figure out if there's anybody else with them, and see what salaries match up, right? Who are the players at the same salary? Obviously, less you can't swap to more unless you leave yourself salary on the table. But who are the players at the same salary or salary combination that you're going to be swapping to? And usually that's pretty easy. Like, you don't need a spreadsheet. Usually you can just take them out of the lineup and see, like, okay, who else fits in? You could click around a couple of times on FanDuel or DraftKings and play with it. You don't even have to save the lineup. But to go back to the Discord question, like, should we be building lineups in favor of players for late swap? This kind of ties into something that we've talked a lot about on the cash game review show, and not so much in here because we have limited times in the theory, but my thoughts on ownership in cash games, specifically 50-50s or double ups. If there's a player that is going to be in 80% of lineups or 60-70% of lineups in cash games, like, if I feel like should I fade them? Should I be playing them a lot of times because they're expensive? If a Cooper Cup's going to be in 80% of cash games, like, I'm just going to go with the field, because if he hits and I don't have him, I'm screwed. And that's happened the last few weeks. Lineups without Cooper Cup just haven't been able to hit. So it's like, he's going to be in every lineup. If he's in 100% of lineups and he doesn't hit, why would I not play him? It's not a GPP. I'm not going for first. I'm going for 50, for just above 50th percent. So it's kind of the same thing. Like, unless it is such a close situation, like you mentioned, I'm not like going to change my mind just because of the time slot. We're still looking for our best values, but we are but we do have it in the back of our mind. And before we get into the specifics of how we use late swap and what it is, like, just the number one rule, for not the number one rule, but like a 100% of the time rule: always use your latest and most expensive player in your flex spot. Just no matter who that is. We don't know what's going to happen in the early window. We don't even know if we're going to have to use late swap. Just do it. If you don't want to be caught like with your pants down, so to speak, and just not be able to swap somebody.
I was going to say, that's a fundamental from season-long fantasy where most of us are coming over from.
And man, I'll see it in winning millionaire and Sunday Million lineups where they won and their flex player was an early game. I'm like, you're so, like, literally so lucky if you had to make a swap and you needed to swap from wide receiver and running back and you couldn't because you didn't do that one little thing and it potentially cost you $1 million. I mean, get to hide the sharp objects, because that is just like the worst spot to be in. But let's get into the specifics of late swap. What's the most? Let's talk. Let's talk GPP, because I think it is the most common late swap scenario, but we can get into some cash if it just comes through naturally. But what's the most common scenario where you're looking to use late swap?
Well, usually it's my 1 p.m. players haven't played very well.
Yeah.
That's really the simple answer. Is I have lineups in my pool of lineups that are dead in the water if I don't do anything. And I want to stop right there and say, think about how freeing from a whatever you can do standpoint that statement is. Your lineups are going to lose anyway.
Yeah.
So even if we are playing cash games, we get to just open up the field, open up our minds a little bit, and use our imaginations. Get weird with things is something that I often try to think about in this hour, or as I'm creating my rankings for late swap. And it's not as simple as this, but I really think my late swap options start by just going to the 4for4 lineup generator, because you can sort by ceiling in one click, or you can just go to our floor and ceiling projections, and then you can just sift out our afternoon games with one filter click. So from there, all of a sudden, I have a list of players who, in the back of my mind, regardless of salary, have the ability to break the slate. And I literally call my late swap rankings slate breaker rankings, because ultimately that is the type of score I need to find in the player pool from the afternoon when my 1 p.m.s don't hit.
So to be clear, like this, so the most common situation is you have the early slate, your early players just did horrible. Most likely you have a player that is chalky or at least somewhat chalky. So even if he goes off for 30 points, if half the field has him, you're not going to gain enough ground with your crappy lineup to cash in anything, right? So you need to swap to not only a player that is like, if it's really bad, you probably need a sub 5% player, but also you need that player to have the realistic ability to go off for 40 points. So like swapping to a KJ Osborne, even if he goes off for 20 points, you're probably not catching the field, right? You need to hopefully have enough salary to swap to like a I don't whoever the mid-tier players are. So like if you're doing a 2v2 swap, like at least give one of your players, like I'd rather have go like a studs and duds approach where, you know, I might have a KJ Osborne in that swap who might only give me 10 or 15, but I can get up to the player that at least has 50-point potential. Like at least give yourself some outs, right? So I think that is the most common scenario. Another scenario, which is a better spot to be in, is when you have a chance to come in first place or place very high in tournaments. So let's talk about the specifics of that. What does that look like when you're thinking about a late swap? Maybe you're like let's say you're in fourth place and you have one player left. What's going through your mind in that late swap scenario? What are you looking for?
Well, first of all, I want to know the other people around me, and I want to know their lineups and their PMR, their player minutes remaining, like the back of my hand. I want to know it as well as I know my own lineups, because the difference in my PMR versus their PMR is going to dictate how contrarian or chalky I want to be.
Yes.
And so there isn't always
PMR is for new listeners. PMR is player minutes remaining, and it'll show it really quickly on FanDuel or DraftKings. It'll show exactly so go ahead.
Yeah, no, and it's just a great one cumulative metric for how many plays you've got left versus versus your opponent. It's really, really helpful. And in that case, the general approach name I have for it, and again, this is just a silly label I have for it, is chalk plus weird approach. And so and that aligns with studs and duds. Often you're finding a chalky high salary play, and then you're going to balance that with an off the wall GPP or large field style play to get contrarian most often. But it doesn't have to be that way. It can often be a situation where you reverse it and there's a player who is fundamentally mispriced, as we've said a couple times, but in the wrong direction, therefore creating a situation where they're not as popular. That can be viable in that situation. But to go back to answering your question, the real thing you have to do in a situation where you're actually competing for first place is know what parts of your lineup are the exact same as your opponents, and just make sure you're different enough to take it down alone.
Yeah. How can you explain how you can have a pretty good idea of like knowing if you have the exact players, say of the players ahead of you?
Yeah, particularly in, after the early games close, you can get a really good idea if they have one or two players left. You look at the salary of that player left, and you probably have like a 1 in 2, 1 in 3 chance of guessing who that exact player is. So in that case, now you're just trying to get leverage off that one player. And this is something that we talked about in our leverage episode a while back. But the easiest way to gain leverage on an opponent is to fade their chalky play. It's not the only way to get leverage on an opponent. So we brought up Cooper Kupp as a smash play a bunch this week. If you think you have Cooper Kupp and your opponent has Cooper Kupp, that doesn't mean unilaterally get off Cooper Kupp. Not by any means. It means that you're just going to have to do something different with a lower part of that salary tier, simply because his salary is so high.
Yeah. So the easiest example is you're in second place going into the afternoon games. You have, let's say, Derrick Henry left. Let's say Derrick Henry costs $9,000. You look at the first place lineup ahead of you. You add up all of their players, and they have $9,000 left. Most likely, especially if it's a running back slot, that player is going to be Derrick Henry, unless there's a running back that is, say, $8,900 in the same slot. If it's a wide receiver, $7,700, say Mike Evans, and that other player has a $7,700 wide receiver left, even if there's a $7,300 Stephon Diggs, it's almost certainly going to be Mike Evans, not Stephon Diggs. There just aren't that many players leaving more than like $200 or even $300 of salary on the table. So you're definitely taking a risk, but it's a risk worth taking, especially when you're playing for that high buy-in. Now, let's break this down a little bit more. What about, let's say, that's the easiest scenario. A lot of more likely you'll probably be third or fourth, and you're gonna have to do some guessing. It's not always like for sure. Let's say you're in fourth place and you have a chance at first place. You also risk swapping and tumbling down the leaderboard, letting other people catch you. So how do you think about that?
If there was one right answer, I think we'd all be millionaires off DFS. But ultimately, I think that it is a case by case basis.
Yeah.
One thing that I've been noticing this year too is that with the afternoon games, we've had a lot of the league's best offenses in these afternoon games, and so we're getting a ton of high expected ownership, high projection players in the afternoon games, which is kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because you're getting these scores, these have-to-have-it scores, similar to like Cooper Cup. And you're also having these fantastic late swap options when you are trying to be contrarian in a situation like we're explaining. They're appealing enough. It checks enough of the boxes that you can make a move. I think in general, it's just about staying with the value plays. We're not moving against the value metric of 4 for 4. We're still staying in line with things unless we need to make drastic changes when our 1 PMs have really gone under.
Yeah, I think the two things you want to think about if you're in that scenario is this payout structure of your tournament, right? So if you're in a structure that's very flat, say you are sitting at say you're sitting at $1,000 and first place is $5,000, you might, if you fall down the leaderboard, the payout's so flat that you might drop to $500. Like, if you're playing within your bankroll, you shouldn't really care that much. You should be going for first almost every time in that scenario because you're not losing that much. In a super top heavy payout structure, I think it's going to depend on your risk tolerance and where you're at in the tournament. If it's something, say, second place is $50,000, first place is $100,000, but then 10th place you go down to like $1,000 and you're sitting in second place, you really have to figure out how much does that extra $50,000 mean to you, because you might gain $50,000 just as easily as you lose $49,000. So that, I think, is the hardest decision. If you're sitting at the 10th place and you're sitting at $1,000, who cares if you tumble down? Like, you're going for that 100,000. But if you're sitting at that $50,000, that's the hardest decision point, I think. Now, something like the millionaire, I think you got to go for it. But if it's a smaller top heavy tournament, but like, you're in that 50 to 100K range, I think the decision is a lot closer. And I think you probably have to start texting people really, really fast and figuring out what the move is there. Let's talk about using late swap for a leverage opportunity. And this is one that we saw come up last week with Foster Moreau. When you had Darren Waller, we thought he might be out, but we weren't sure. How can you use that information to your advantage?
Yeah, I think this situation, especially with like Foster Moreau, is he just becomes an option, but at the same time, I don't have to go there. So those are actually ideal situations because Foster Moreau can be in that label I chose. He can be my weird play.
Yes.
But if I need to go away from it, or if I find that I think it's going to be a chalky play all of a sudden, then obviously the situation changes a little bit. For the most part, my general rule, especially this is just a general DFS rule, is when a low salary, low probability play becomes popular, that is a time to move away from the field.
Yeah.
I don't always make that call, but in general, I want to be with the field when it's a great play in a great situation. If it's not that, then I'm probably looking elsewhere.
Yeah, I will. So last week, what we had basically was late Saturday night, early Sunday morning. We got question of if whether or not Darren Waller was going to be active. They weren't playing until the late window, so you could build with Moreau, who was all the way down at 2,500 on DraftKings. I think Waller was in his 6,000 range or whatever it was. But the problem was, like, if he's active, what do you do? So in those scenarios, here's what we know for sure. Waller and Moreau are probably both going to be super low owned because most people aren't even going to think about taking on the injury risk. So I think it is insanely valuable to lean into these situations. The thing is, you need to think about, especially when it's going to be pivoting to like a men's salary or near men's salary player. This is where I would prioritize, even if it's not my perfect lineup, a second player in the late window, because I think those are the scenarios where you have to have at least a 2v2. Because if you have a $2,500 Foster Moreau and then Darren Waller plays, now you're screwed. Now who do you pivot to? Someone that's going to play 2 snaps. So in those situations, I think you need to have a 2v2, maybe even a 3v3 ready to go in case Waller is active. So I would build my lineup with Moreau, knowing I'm going to get him at like 2% like he was last week, but have a contingency plan in place. So, but that is a crazy leverage opportunity because you're going to get a men's salary starting player that's probably going to be in less than 5% of lineups. And it's very rare to be able to get that. And again, that's specific to injury, waiting for injury news on the late window.
Yeah, I think in general too, like just adding to that, part of optionality, when we talk about that exact word, part of optionality is having enough salary to have options. And so Foster Moreau's min salary looks fantastic until you have to move from it, as you said, because you have no other options. Adding just a singular other player then gives you enough salary, especially if it's a high salary player. Then all of a sudden, the total amount of salary available to you and therefore the options goes way up.
Yeah. Let's move on to a couple quick notes on cash games. If you're playing 50-50s or double ups, like the concepts are exactly like what we talked about here. You're basically swapping to try to hit the cash line. So if you're screwed, it's very easy. Just get off your chalk player. What about head to heads? How are you going about, like, if you're playing, let's say you max enter $1 through $5 head to heads on DraftKings, you have 200 head to heads going. How are you going through one by one on your head to heads, or like, what is your approach there?
I mean, I won't lie. Like, I'm that person, like
It's
going
hard.
through
I mean,
on
time's
my
an issue.
app.
Yeah. You are
But
doing it?
I mean, not formally, but
Yeah.
informally, I'm just staring at all my head-to-heads in the early, I'm on the East Coast, especially as I round the corner, 2:50 p.m.,
Yeah.
3 p.m. I'm just naturally in my phone looking at my scores anyway.
Yep.
And so I do start to get an idea. I guess I'll put it this way. I want an idea of what the general cash game lineups look like. For instance, last week's a great example because I played Derrick Henry and then I noticed a significant amount of the field wasn't playing Derrick Henry. I
Yeah.
had already differentiated my lineup in a way that I felt like, okay, if I do late swap, which I did, I don't need to go so far down my list. And I ended up on Godwin and the Buccaneers defense, not something I typically do, wide receiver and a defense in a cash lineup. It doesn't work as well as it did last week, but ultimately that's the way I'm thinking about things. If
Yeah.
I differentiated already, then I can make different late swap options. But ultimately, it's the same thing. I'm trying to see how get the gist of the field and swap enough to be different from them as needed based on my 1 PMs.
Yeah. I think the hardest head to head scenario is when you have like a 50th percentile ish lineup, because if your team's going off, you can just look for the couple teams that you're losing to and see if there's any late swap scenario, and just look at PMR. If they have less, more PMR than you, then you could look for late swaps if you're already losing. If you're getting smoked and you're like having like a 10th percentile week, you can just do a universal late swap in cash. You don't even need to look at it. Like whatever, you might give up a little bit equity in 10 lineups, but you can win your other 150 if your swap goes right. The tough part is if you're like in that 50th percentile, because you're beating some teams, you're losing to some teams. You can't universal late swap, because if it goes bad, now all of your games you're winning, you lose. So in that scenario, what I do is I go to the games I'm losing, go to the lineups where have the biggest gap, and start with the biggest gap in PMR. So I'm losing in PMR and I'm losing in points, I'll start swapping those. Just start swap as much as I can. Obviously, time is an issue. And then if I have time, I'll start looking at the ones that are closer. What's PMR look like? Click those real quick. Is it the same number of players? All right, I'll do a couple swaps. Like you can't, in those scenarios, like it's not going to be perfect, but like you're just trying to give yourself the most outs as possible. And obviously time's going to be an issue. You're not going to get to all of them if you're playing a ton of head to heads, but like, I think that's a pretty quick way to do it. One last late swap question, and one that I don't think a lot of people talk about, because they talk about, we just talked about, what if you're leading? What if you're in first place in a GPP and you, let's say you had 8 out of your 9 players were in the early slate. Your only player left is a contrarian player. If there's a chalky player left and it is a very popular, similar salary, if you're winning, how do you feel about switching off your somewhat contrarian player to the chalky player and hopefully hold your place?
If you've already done something different in your lineup,
Yeah.
so different, in fact, that you're in first place, that you're winning, then go with the wisdom of the crowd.
Yeah.
If that feels better than saying play the chalk, go with the wisdom of the crowd. The crowd knows what they're doing in this field. And so in that case, you're playing the chalk.
Yeah, there is a little bit of metagame. Like if you go, if the PMR is super close, the points are close, and you have a second and a third place, you reverse engineer, and they have the same player, then there's a little bit of, I know he's going to swap. What do I do? Like that is like pretty close. But what you're looking, I think if your PMR, if there's nobody, like if say you have 1 game left, if somebody has like 240 PMR right behind you, maybe you make a switch. But as long as like they're pretty close, I think the move in that scenario, you're in first place, you got a somewhat contrarian player and not the super chalky play. Like this happened to me with Kareem Hunt a couple of weeks ago. Like I didn't have enough salary to actually get to him, so it didn't matter, but I had to think about it. Like you're in first place, you don't have the chalky player left, but you have salary to get to the chalky player, and there aren't players that are like blowing you out in PMR within like whatever that are in shooting distance. I think you just swap to the chalk guy there. I think that's the move.